Harry Truman had only been vice president for 82 days when President Franklin Roosevelt passed away from a brain hemorrhage on April 14, 1945. Within 4 months, Truman would be sworn into office, learn about the Manhattan Project, oversee victory in Europe, and finally give orders to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in the Pacific. While facing this immense pressure, it was certainly not helpful that the space in which Truman worked, lived, and entertained had begun to feel as strained and worn down as the nation itself. It was clear the White House needed updating, but what would begin with plans for simple renovations would end in a 4-year-long reconstruction of the nation's most famous house from the inside out. Over the 145 years between when John Adams first moved into the White House and when the Truman family took residence in 1945, the executive mansion underwent many changes. By far the most dramatic came during the War of 1812, when the British launched an attack on the American capital and burned the White House to the ground. The destruction was so total that only 2 items from before the assault still sit in the White House today. The first of these objects is Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington, which currently hangs in the East Room. The second is a small wooden medicine chest which still sits downstairs in the map room. Both items were saved by First Lady Dolly Madison, who chose to evacuate with the Washington portrait rather than the couple's personal belongings. After the fire, it took 3 years for the White House to be rebuilt. Over the next century, many presidents left their mark in the building, including Grant, who remodeled the first floor, and Teddy Roosevelt, who expanded the mansion's living space to accommodate his large family. The Great Depression and World War II brought about more changes, including the construction of a bomb shelter and the addition of a heated indoor swimming pool for FDR's polio therapy. In an interesting moment to imagine, at one point after the attack on Pearl Harbor, civil defense officials proposed that the White House be painted camouflage, but President Roosevelt rejected the idea. Despite all the changes over the years, the White House was in dire need of renovation by the time Truman assumed the presidency. The wooden structure of the mansion had weakened to the point that the president's bathtub had started to sink into the floor. Truman even joked that one day the entire tub would fall through the ceiling in the midst of a Daughters of the American Revolution tea. In addition to these problems, the growing size of the executive branch meant more office space was needed for the White House staff. Truman worked with the White House architect to draw up plans for the modest renovations, including an expansion of the executive office building and the replacement of floorboards in the second-floor living quarters. However, a media misrepresentation of Truman's proposal led to significant public opposition that eventually stopped work before it ever began. But Harry Truman was not a man to back down from a fight. In the summer of '47, he proposed a simple but personal change to the mansion, the addition of a second-floor balcony on the south side of the building. Despite more public uproar, the plans went forward and the balcony was completed in March of 1948. This first small change would turn out to be only the beginning. The incident that kicked off the eventual gutting and rebuilding of the White House happened in August of 1948, a few months before Truman won re-election. Truman's daughter, Margaret, was playing piano in the second-floor fitting room. As she played, the leg of the grand piano crashed through the floor, and it could be seen sticking out of the ceiling in the family dining room below. Investigators looked into the structural integrity of the building and quickly determined that the White House was unsafe to live in. The whole building was on the verge of collapse. By Thanksgiving, Truman moved out of the White House and demolition soon began. Truman moved across the street to a building known as Blair House, a building only a few decades younger than the one they had just left. Blair House was a 124-year-old 4-story yellow stucco house 1 block down from the White House. The State Department had bought the building in 1942 as a guest house for important foreign dignitaries. Truman had actually lived in Blair House before, while he was waiting for Mrs. Roosevelt to move out of the White House after the death of FDR. In a wild story that we'll cover in another episode, tragedy nearly struck at Blair House while he was living there when there was an assassination attempt by a pair of Puerto Rican independence activists. Though Truman was unharmed, a White House policeman would lose his life in the attack and became the only man to be killed while actively protecting the president. The man's name was Leslie Coffelt, and we will cover his story at a later date. While Truman and his family were settling in at Blair House, work began back at the White House. The demolition and reconstruction of the mansion took place quite literally from inside out. This process of renovation was an incredible feat of engineering. With the exterior stone walls remaining in place, workers dismantled the entire interior of the building. This left behind a gigantic hollow space, 165 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 70 to 80 feet high. With the interior gutted, the next problem that needed to be addressed was the slow sinking foundation. Engineers were forced to dig 20 feet below the previous foundation before they found firm ground. They then dug 126 huge rectangular pits and filled them with reinforced concrete to create a series of powerful support columns. In order to dig the pits, engineers asked President Truman's permission to tear down an original wall to get a bulldozer inside the structure. Truman refused due to the historic nature of the wall in question. Workers were forced to take apart the bulldozer piece by piece and reassemble it inside the walls. The next stage of the renovation process was putting the new steel framing that would act as the backbone of the mansion. As construction proceeded into the early summer of 1950, Truman faced the outbreak of war in Korea. The renovations continued despite shortages caused by the conflict. The war presented unavoidable obstacles to completing the renovations on schedule. Truman's original deadline for completion was October of 1951, but this date soon passed by. Next, Truman requested that his family make it back into the White House by Christmas, but this became impossible to achieve. Finally, on March 27, 1952, Truman moved back into the finished White House. 2 days later, he announced that he was not seeking re-election. One of the first guests to visit the newly renovated White House was Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady who had lived in the mansion alongside her husband for over a decade. After a personal tour by Truman, she expressed her unimpressed opinions of the renovations, saying it looked like a Sheraton hotel. While the updates to the White House might not have passed the judgments of the previous First Lady, there's no denying the remarkable achievement of the renovations. The building was saved from almost certain collapse and was completed in a manner nobody ever tried before. Most importantly, the building maintained the iconic appearance which had made it such an important national symbol. And thanks to the remarkable work of the engineers involved with the project, the spirit of the White House that has stood since the days of John Adams lives on for every future American president.